we've come from a long ways away in time, right? We started roughly 2 billion years ago. We talked about, or more or less a billion years ago, right, is about where we were when we talked about the breakup of Rodinia, what life was like in the Precambrian times. We went through all the periods, the geologic periods, right? Cambrian, Ordovician, Silurian, Devonian, you name it. Then we got all the way up to the modern day, and we started talking about the evolution of various kinds of organismal groups. And we said, we looked at when the land plants got here, and we really pointed out some of the diversification of animals, and especially focused in on what life has been like in this region in the Mid-South over the last many millions of years. And so then we got all the way down to the end of the Ice Age, the end of the Pleistocene. And with that, we reach this really monumental point in Earth history, and especially in the history of North America, because it also coincides with the first people arriving to North America. So where our story picks up today is on the people aspect of natural history. Now, I know what you're probably thinking. I didn't sign up to take a history class, right? Well, there's a lot of history in what's coming over the next couple of lectures. We're going to break those up because I'm going to give you what I can today with the 3 hours that I have you. We'll take our midterm on Thursday, and then we'll probably come back with one more lecture devoted to human history. And then the entire rest of the class is describing the ecosystems of Tennessee. It brings us all the way up to the modern day with how people have interacted with the land, how they manage the land with fire, with the arrival of agriculture, how they started deforesting the landscape, how they began to kill off wildlife like bison and beavers and wolves, and then how they began to transform the landscape through man's presence. As various groups of people, Native Americans originally, then various bands of Europeans, and then with African Americans, how did all this begin to shape the modern landscape? Finally, we'll get into this next Tuesday, as more and more especially European Americans came onto the scene, they were also bringing with them scholarly thoughts from Europe. They were talking about science and geology, and ecology became a thing. This is long before conservation began to emerge as a discipline. They wanted to know, what are all the species that are here, plants and animals? What are these ecosystems? So we'll briefly look at the emergence of science as it relates to natural history, and what these early contributions of some of these early scientists were, all the way up then until that's where is that's sort of jumping off point for the rest of the class, which is, what are all these kinds of ecosystems that we see before us, and how do we make sense of it all? Okay. So with that, we're going to jump right into the human element to this. Let's step back in time to 23,000 years before present. And you're going to see variously in history, you're going to see different ways of referencing time. You may see BC and AD, right? Before Christ, after death, is a common way to reference time. You may see YBP, which means year before present. So we'll talk briefly about that. The span of time that we're going to be covering today is the very tail end of the Pleistocene epoch, so roughly 23,000 years ago. Up to about 11,500 years ago begins that's the starting point for the Holocene epoch, which is what we are currently living in. So we're really going to focus most of our discussion on the Holocene for these next two periods, but we have to kind of barely go back and just clip the end of the Pleistocene again. As we do that, we're going to go through several major sort of time periods with respect to humans here in North America. We're going to introduce what we call pre-Columbus people. We're going to talk about the Paleo Indians, the Archaic Indians, the woodland tribes, the Mississippians. Then we're going to get into the modern era, talking about what we call the proto-historic tribes, and then the modern tribes. Next Tuesday's lecture especially will focus on the non-Native American participants and inhabitants of this landscape. So we will introduce the various Europeans, for example. Actually, we'll do that today. We don't have to wait till Tuesday. The various European superpowers that came to dominate this region. And we'll talk about the influence of the importation of African-American slaves on the landscape as well. All right, so let's jump right in. Just a quick definition. What do we mean by prehistoric, protohistoric, and historic? Basically, prehistoric means the time before written history. Okay, so if you go back 5,000 years ago or 10,000 years ago, these are prehistoric bits of time. Historic, which is the opposite, means it's within the time of recorded history. There are people writing about what's happening. Now, the challenge with most Native American groups is they don't have written histories. Now, there's some exceptions to that. Cherokee, for example, developed a written language fairly recently, like in the very latest 1700s. They then started to record their own histories. But prior to that, most Native American tribes in the United States didn't have a written language and they didn't have written histories. So whatever was written about them was written by Europeans who came in or African Americans who came in who had that knowledge, but largely by European Americans. What's in between is what we call proto-historic. That's the brief period of time where Native Americans are largely still living without the influence of Europeans, but they have had contact. And we know this through things like trade. They might have received some trade goods like glass beads or pieces of glass, maybe some metal objects. Or they might have acquired diseases, which devastated some of their populations. But generally speaking, it's early enough, it's before Europeans wrote about that contact, right? That comes a little bit later. So that in-between period is what we call the proto-historic period. We'll get into that. As I said, when we're talking about time frames, you'll kind of see me use these interchangeably. YBP is years before present. BC is before Christ and after death. So that's about 2,000 years ago. If we go back to say, the time of Christ, approximately 2,000 years ago. Anything after that is AD. Anything before that is BC. A lot of times nowadays, though, the preferred sort of standard is to go with BCE or just simply CE, and that refers to without any kind of reference to let's say Christianity particularly. So you could go BCE or CE. Basically means before the current era is what that refers to. Okay. Another thing we ought to probably just highlight is the distinction between paleontology and archaeology. There are lots of sites that exist in the world that are both paleontological sites and they are archaeological sites. What's the distinction between the two? Yeah. That's right. Archaeology specifically is human. Paleontology refers to fossilized plants and animals. But there are some sites like mammoth butcher sites where Native Americans have killed and butchered, disassembled a mammoth, right? That is both a paleontological site from the mammoth perspective, and it's an archaeological site from the human perspective, okay? So we, by and large, in this region of the South, there are extremely few sites that qualify both as paleontological and archaeological. And that's because there's not a lot of sites that are, we have very demonstrable, clear evidence of humans, killing and butchering and eating prehistoric Pleistocene animals like mammoths and mastodons and those kinds of things. There's very, very few sites. Now, part of the knowledge that we have for informing the archaeological record and prehistoric information comes from carbon dating. And so carbon dating gets us back to roughly about 45 to 50,000 years. So that's a good time period. We don't need to go back to, in North America. In Europe, they have human remains and Neanderthal remains that go back, hundreds of thousands of years, 200,000 or 300,000 years. In Africa, they have human remains that go back a few million years, all right? So there you need different kinds of dating techniques to be able to go back that far. But here in North America, if you have a site that's 12,000 years old or 35,000 years old or 10,000 or 400 years old, carbon dating is the best approach to be able to use for that. Here's the general sort of rationale behind carbon dating. Let's say you have a plant here, in this case, a corn plant absorbs carbon during the process of photosynthesis, okay? That carbon comes really in kind of two forms. It has what we call isotopes, carbon-12 and carbon-14. And that's based on the number of neutrons in the nucleus, if you recall. A turkey then consumes some of that carbon when it eats the part of this plant. Carbon then is absorbed into all the tissues of the turkey, including into its bones. Okay, so then that turkey lives for a while, it's killed and it's butchered, and one of its leg bones is made into a Native American tool. Here we see this bone tool. The carbon from the plant that it originally had eaten, or many of the plants which it eats, so you can look at the dietary sort of trends, is still in the tissues of that bone. And so we can determine the relative amount of the two different isotopes that are present, either carbon-12 or carbon-14. As soon as the turkey dies, the carbon is absorbed, that is absorbed during its lifetime, begins to decay through radioactive decay at a very known, precise rate, releasing radioactive carbon-14. Carbon-12 is the stable isotope, so that one does not decay. Carbon-14 is radioactive, which means that it begins to break down over time. That breakdown happens at a very consistent pace, and each isotope has what we call a half-life. So we can measure how long of a time span it takes then for exactly half of that substance to decay. So we can extract those carbon-14 isotopes from those tissues. An archaeologist then can study that in the lab using radiocarbon dating. And they can then find, that bone awl, let's say, is underground as part of the archaeological investigations. We extract that in the lab to measure then how much carbon-14 is left in the bone to determine the exact age of when the turkey died. Again, it's based on this organic carbon. That's the key. It's got to be organic. And so we cannot use radiometric dating, carbon dating for dating sort of non-biological material. Yes.
Is this image of the machine they're using for this process?
I think so. Yeah.
It's like a rotating PET scanner kind of thing.
Yeah, I really don't know what that, too much about the analytical approaches, but that's my understanding is that's sort of a machine. And what I really wanted you guys is just sort of have the idea of the connectivity between, we make an archaeological find, right? It's a turkey bone, but it's from the diet of that turkey that we're able to infer not only its dietary sort of preferences, which can be determined isotopically. Remember we talked about the gray fossil site? I think I alluded to, they can look at the enamel in the tooth enamel of mammoths and determine whether they had a diet that primarily consisted of grasses or a diet that consisted of like broadleaf forbs or wildflowers. That's very important because if it's a diet consisting almost totally of grasses, that means that area was probably a grassland around it. So you can make those kind of determinations based on the diet. And if you have a really sound knowledge of isotope chemistry, then that can inform a lot about our understanding of archaeology and paleontology. But then more importantly, of course, is just the general concept of radiometric dating, carbon dating, when it comes to being able to age things that are biological organic materials. That's a very important concept. So this is one way that we might estimate or calculate the ages of something that we recover from these sites. Another way, though, is we can use various indices. So pottery, for example. Wait a minute, Dr. Estes. We're supposed to be talking about biology. Now you're going to start throwing out some clay pottery. Okay, well, just hang with me for a second, okay? Pottery recovered from places like here in the Southeast at various types of earthen mounds, for example, or basketry from the American Southwest. They can date those types and patterns of pottery and basketry to very precise time periods. Here's some examples. This particular named type, the Chapin black on white, dates specifically to the years 575 to 880 AD. This type here, the Mesa Verde black on white, has a very narrow window from 1180 to 1280. So in the archaeological community, they can use other things to help date precisely. Now, in the paleontological world, well, you were telling me this the other night, Cooper. We were talking, Kian. we were talking about index fossils, and you mentioned that you were hunting some crinoids at Land Between the Lakes. So we can use certain kinds of index fossils too. A certain species of fossil or certain group of fossil can serve as an index or a reference for a particular point in time. So we can use all of those as techniques to kind of understand time frames. Now, another cool way to sort of get at the ages of stuff is we can use tree rings. So out in various places, we use tree rings a lot here in the Southeast to kind of understand the growth patterns of tree species in relation to climate or wildfire or flooding. And in places like out in the American Southwest, Mesa Verde National Park, for example, they can even take tree rings from the rafters of these Pueblo buildings, and they can take a little core with an increment borer and analyze those little sections of wood. And then they can sort of line those up using statistical packages to determine the points of overlap between two different sections of trees. So right here, for example, that year 1871, which is a very narrow year, it had a very narrow range, meaning that conditions were very hard that year. Probably was an extreme drought. They can match that up between samples across different time periods. By looking at the cross dating is what this is referred to as. The samples that are in wooden structures, they can do this in violins, they can do it in pianos, they can go out there and take a section out of a tree or a stump that's been left in the woods after a logging event. They can do it from an old rail fence. You take all these things and you begin to cross date them, we can get chronologies, which is the word for it, that in some cases go back several thousand years for a given region. So like in the Southwest, we have chronologies that extend back probably 10,000 years just from using tree rings. And it's a convenient way to kind of look at the dating of sort of looking at time over that sort of fairly short window. Here in the Southeast, our best chronologies using tree ring approaches just go back probably a couple thousand years, maybe 3,000 or 4,000 years in some cases. Now, another way that we can kind of begin to understand archaeology and keep, I want you to keep focused on the message, which is we're going to get to how did people influence the Mid-South? What was the influence of Native Americans in this particular lecture on this region we call the Mid-South? And so we have to kind of understand just the rudiments of some of those kinds of dating approaches so we can have a frame of reference for when they lived. How do you know they lived 5,000 years ago? How do we know that the first documented footprints of Native Americans were 21,000 years ago? Well, we can use those dating approaches that I just kind of alluded to. Another thing we can do, we can't date these directly because they're non-living materials. These are not organic, but we can look at, we'll call it stone tools or projectile points. Different kinds of the different shapes and patterns of the stone tools appear at different points during the prehistoric record. These particular stone tools that you're looking at, for example, date to probably like 9,000 or 10,000 years old. So they're very precise. If a collector of stone tools were to find this out in a plowed up cornfield, they'd be able to pick it up instantly and look at it and say, that's a 9,000-year-old spear point, right? They would know, based on what we know from these, that it's not 300 years old, that it's not a 500-year-old arrowhead, right? Or it's not a 3,000-year-old spear point. They know based on the science of these that we can date this very precisely to approximately 9,000 or 10,000 years ago based on the design of that one spear point. So we're going to take all those kinds of forms of dating evidence. And in addition to some of the other approaches that we've talked about previously, like pollen studies and so forth, now what we want to do is begin to cover these major groups of people as they were arriving. So the very first groups of people to come to North America are what we call pre-Clovis culture, okay, pre-Clovis. I'm going to get into why we call them Clovis in a minute and pre-Clovis. But generally speaking, this is the time period from about 3,000 years ago to about 13,500 years before the current era, basically before today. All right, what you're seeing here is a general theme of pre-Clovis times. People were here when there were still megafauna of the Pleistocene. There were still things like camels and mastodons and mammoths and horses and musk oxen and short-faced bear and dire wolves and saber-toothed cats roaming around North America while there were people here. There were also still a mile of ice over New York City at the same time that there were people exploring across North America. They probably saw that 1 mile high glacier over places like Cleveland, Ohio. They would have been here also when those ice dams broke that we talked about, like Glacial Lake Missoula, when it burst and the whole eastern half of the state of Washington got flooded with a giant ice dam that broke. They would have seen that flood. People would have been probably caught up in those floodwaters. They would have been killed. So they would have experienced the Ice Age, this group of people we call the pre-Clovis people. Now, recently, over the past decade or so, some really new emerging evidence for this group of people has come to light from a special place in New Mexico called White Sands National Monument. This is an area out in the desert, the Chihuahuan Desert, where they have uncovered footprints of many individuals, kids and parents and elderly people walking side by side, hand in hand. And you can see kind of what they look like here with sort of this ground penetrating sort of radar. They look like these impressions. In some cases, as they've uncovered these, you can see the ruler up here. I mean, these are very recognizable human footprints. They've been able to date these footprints very precisely because of how they are embedded in the sediments. So imagine if you're walking across a pond shore in bare feet, right? You can feel that mud between your toes. And imagine that the layer that is immediately beneath your feet, you know, you're kind of compressing it, right? What's underneath your foot? Well, there's mud, obviously. Maybe there's a couple pieces of gravel and sand, but there's probably spores of plants, and there's probably seeds of the plants that grow along the shoreline. Seeds are probably under your feet, getting squashed underneath your footprints, right? And then imagine that a flood comes and deposits a new layer of silt down on top of your footprints. And then maybe at some point later, an animal comes and walks by. Maybe it's a mammoth, and they walk over. Well, there's going to be another layer that separates your footprints from theirs. And there may be additional seed layers and spores in those additional layers. All of those add up over time, are of different ages, right? And of course, the further down you go, what? The older it is. So you can precisely date those layers. You can't take the sand grain out and date it with radiometric carbon dating. Why? Yeah, there's no carbon isotopes in sand. It's inorganic. But you can take the seed from that plant that was photosynthetic, and you can subject it to radiocarbon dating, and you can tell exactly how old that seed was because it has carbon in it, carbon-14. Then you take a seed out from just above the foot. Let's say if this is the footprint layer, take a seed out below it, and you go up to the layer above it. You take some seeds and spores out, and you date that one. So then what you have is you have very nicely dated the layers below and above the footprint, right? And you can independently do that with other footprints, right? You can excavate down and take a lot of independent data sets. And what they all show then is that the footprints in between those two layers are 21,000 years old. What that means is that's conclusively the oldest confirmed documented evidence of Native Americans, indisputable evidence of Native Americans from 21,000 years ago in New Mexico. Here's what some of those footprints look like as they're studying these sites. You can see there's both human trackways here. There's mammoth trackways as well. So whereas mammoths and humans are walking over the exact same path. And this shows how far down they are. Now you can see the different layers of sedimentary layers have been laid down on top. It's in those distinct layers is where they would extract the seeds that they've used in to age these particular footprints and where they are. Here's just a few examples of some of these footprints. Anybody have any ideas on what these might be from? Maybe the far left. Looks like a dog to you? Yeah. It could be a dog of some type, a canine. What about there in the middle? Maybe a horse. It's a little bit bilobed, like two cloven hooves. A deer, maybe a camel. Okay. And these could be mammoths or mastodons as big as those are. This shows what an artist's rendering shows from the white sand site. So today it's a desert with sand dunes, but back during the late ice age, when things were cooler and wetter, excuse me, it was actually a lake plain where there was lots of vegetation. It was a grassland. There were scattered vernal pools of open water. And these Native Americans were living there with a whole suite of megafauna that are today extinct, like mammoths, camels, giant ground sloths. And as they're walking, as the Native Americans are walking with dire wolves, then these other big animals are also making their footprints, all of which are being preserved in that record at the same time. All right. Now, what's really cool about that then is that means that there were people living in New Mexico, right here where this red star is, by 21,000 years ago. DNA evidence suggests that Native Americans originated in Siberia, somewhere probably in easternmost Mongolia or Siberia, near the Lake Baikal region. Some of them have features that are shared with people sort of in Japan and East Asia, Northeast Asia. The implication then is there's two big sort of theories that have emerged as to how they got to North America. What are those two theories? Anybody want to put those out? Land bridge during the Pleistocene, right? That's one idea. And remember, when the glaciers were fully developed, that means global sea levels dropped, allowing them to walk across land bridge. Or what was the other possible scenario? They could have come the coastal route via boat. So they could have either come overland or they could have come through a coastal route. Now, there are some timing issues that are at play here, because to be able to come across a land bridge means that there has to be a gap through the ice that you could actually make it through. And so there is a brief period of time, which you can see up here, that blue, that section that goes through shows kind of where the ice was. There has to be the right timing for it to come through what's called the ice-free corridor. If they miss that window, then that whole area is completely plugged with glacial ice, which means you can't get through. So unless they just timed it perfectly and were able to come through, that's one scenario. Otherwise, they would have had to use boats to come across and come down into North America. Now, some people have suggested, well, man, look at there, about 21,000 years ago, they were already in New Mexico. By 14.5 thousand years ago, they were in Northwest Florida, as evidenced by what we call the Page-Ladson site. That's an archaeological site. At 14,000 years ago, there's a record of humans from Meadowcroft Rock Shelter in Pennsylvania. And you can see some of these other notable old rock shelter ages here, 13,000, 14.2 thousand, et cetera. But then take a look at South America. Here we have a site called Monteverde, which is in southern Chile, that's 14.2 thousand years old. So somehow they were able to get all the way into southern South America by that point in time. So various people have speculated, okay, they must have had boats to help get down the coastline that quickly. Or others have speculated, well, they came to North America and they would have used the land bridge, and then they would have infiltrated throughout South America. However you account for it, it still is not totally clear, and it's up for debate. And it's really an area of science that is still very hotly debated. Now, stone tools, though, can help to sort of clarify the patterns of migration of people in North America. And so what this collection of images is showing is the stone tools that we find, let's say, out in the western part of America, tend to have what's called sort of a stalked base on it right here. You can see that kind of narrowed down neck right there. Those are not found in eastern North America from the same time period. The ones that we see in the east have this very distinctive pattern like this, where they kind of have a little bit of a notch at the bottom. And oftentimes it looks like there's a place for like a thumb imprint on the top. What we call that is a flute, F-L-U-T-E. And we say that that is a fluted point. So there's two very distinct types of spear points for the west and then for the east, which suggests that these were different people with different technological advancements, that they were using different architectures, different types of stone tool technology. But eventually then, this type, which we call the Western stemmed tradition, is thought to have kind of emerged first. And then the people to the center and in the eastern United States developed this technology either later, or it possibly could represent a distinct and different wave of people into America. If we go with that, then this STEM technology is thought to possibly come through this coastal route of people coming into America by boat along the coastline. And you can see bringing that STEM technology all the way rapidly down to Monteverde, Chile. In contrast, this type of technology, which we call Clovis points, is thought to have possibly emerged either it developed here after sort of evolving from the same people who brought this STEM tradition to America. Maybe they began to go through this evolution of spear point technology, so that at 15,000 years ago, they had these morphed into these about 14,000. And then finally by 13,000, they really advanced. So under that scenario, it's the same group of people who are making these technological innovations, and they're improving upon this existing model. And they said, no, this one's a little bit better. This is a little bit better. So the technology is improving and evolving, but it's evolving in place. Under the competing scenario, the Western STEM tradition is because they came along the coastal route, and that the Clovis model, which is the totally different spear point technology, might have actually been introduced by a completely different wave of people, right? That's a key question. Was it one wave of people, or was it multiple waves of people from the same sort of ancestral region of Siberia? So there are a couple competing hypotheses here that still remain unresolved. And more, as we have evidence from DNA, from ancient DNA, and there are very few remains of people from this time period, number one. And those that are often have the DNA is highly degraded. So more and more, as we have access to ancient DNA and those technologies improve, that should allow us to start competing, assessing these two hypotheses and comparing between to see which one is actually better favored by the existing evidence. So right now, that sort of remains an open area. But for archaeologists, as they begin collecting these stone points throughout North America, this is very useful information that begins to reveal patterns on the landscape. Take a look at this map, for example, and this shows the location of those Clovis type points, which is the ones I showed you here on the far right. If you begin to map all those out that exist in museums and collections, you can see that there's a lot of these, and they clearly are mapping as being located in what we call the ice-free corridor, suggesting they were brought down from Alaska, where that type of technology also exists. So this sort of favors this hypothesis of people coming through the ice-free corridor, then expanding across North America once they got into the United States. What else we can infer from this is where there were some really hot spots of people activity. Notice right here in the Mid-South is one of those hot spots. Tennessee, Kentucky is a big place for this specific type of projectile point. And again, these date to like 10, 11, 12, 13,000 years. So that's conclusive evidence that we had people here, certainly, and we had people here in high numbers. Because these are found I mean, they're rare to find, but they're found still with regularity. So at this point in time, again, first Americans arrived sometime, we know they were here about 21,000 years ago, just to summarize. We have these two competing scenarios. Did they come by water? Did they come through a land route? That's still kind of up for debate. Really, truly settling this involves looking at mitochondrial DNA studies. It also involves the study of linguistics. The study of language evolution can be informative here. Dentition. The tooth patterns of different Native American groups oftentimes reveals and suggests different waves of migration. You can actually tell by the dentition alone some striking patterns that suggest there were not just one wave of migrations, but multiple distinct waves of migration. So the bulk of the evidence, just to summarize, suggests that Native Americans didn't just come one time. They came in multiple waves of migration from Asia into North America. And they were here at least by 13,000 years ago. For this region, 21,000 years ago for New Mexico. All right, now, because we don't know the timing of when Native Americans got here, there's obviously still a lot of loose ends and the questions to be answered. But let's focus on a specific sort of core episode of prehistory. Let's look at that period from like 15,000 up to say about 13 or 12,000 years ago. This is a time period that we're going to designate as what we call pre-Clovis. With this particular time period, there's a lot of stone tool technology out there, which sort of looks like this. It sort of looks like various rock fragments, scrapers for scraping meat off of hides and skin off of hides. There's not a lot of those really well, nicely shaped, what we call Clovis points at this sort of early point prior to about probably 13,000 years ago. There's a very limited number of sites in North America, especially in the Southeast, that have sort of this ancient sort of rudimentary stone tool technology. And there's just a few here. Some of these like 27 is the Page Ladson site in Northwest Florida. That site has mammoth. There is also domesticated dog. So we know humans were domesticating wolves into dogs by that point. This is probably about 14,000 years old. It's how old that site is. But they have the stone tool technology that's sort of rudimentary, like with these sort of broken fragments that you see here. So this kind of characterizes this very earliest sort of wave of people we're going to call pre-Clovis. These were largely nomadic people that we think were sort of, again, domesticating wolves into dogs. They did not have horse domestication at this point. That's there were native horses that were living that were about to go extinct, but the actual horse that, of course, would eventually be domesticated, that won't be here until the 1500s when the Spanish bring them. So the only domestication right now really happening is wolves into dogs. All right, so that's a little bit of that window from about 15,000 to 13,000 that we call pre-Clovis. Now what I want to do is go into the next phase, which is what we call the Paleo Indians. This picks up at about 13,500 years, and this is a really important time marker. That's because that's about the same time that all of the major animals of the Ice Age go extinct. Mammoths go extinct by that point in time. Camels go extinct. Ancient bison go extinct. And remember, we talked about the overkill hypothesis, which suggested that maybe, it lays the blame on the feet of Native Americans as possibly having eliminated all those big animals. A lot of people find that very contentious, and a lot of people suggest that there are other explanations. You remember some of the ones we talked about? What are some of the other possible reasons why Native Americans, why these Ice Age animals might have gone extinct? Climate instability, immediate impact site up in like Greenland, northern Canada, causing massive wildfires. Yeah, so with the climate instability, you could have had major like trophic level instability, right? Plant community types changing so rapidly that food webs were crashing, essentially. Yeah, those are some of the big ones. People have also invoked maybe disease and pandemics and those kind of things. So we're going to get into this period, but before we go much farther, I want to tell you a story about, because I realize that these terms pre-Clovis and Clovis, without some historical context, may not mean much. Let's tell a quick story. This is a former slave by the name of George McJunkin. He was an African-American slave born just before the Civil War into slavery in Texas. And then after which he was freed. And like a lot of African Americans after the Civil War, he moved out west. And in his case, he became a cowboy and moved on to a ranch in New Mexico. One day he was out sort of checking the fences on this ranch in northern New Mexico, and there was a massive flood that had washed away part of the stream valley. So George McJunkin naturally was inclined to have this interest in sort of natural history. He was interested in fossils and rocks and, collecting things. And so he was riding out, sort of checking the stream and how much erosion it had, checking the fences on horseback. And all of a sudden he noticed that there were some bones sticking out of the side of the stream side. And he checked them out, and lo and behold, they turned out to be these really highly specialized stone spear points. And they were named for the nearby town of New Mexico where this ranch was, called Folsom. Folsom, New Mexico. Now, he didn't know they were called Folsom points, right? But he found them. And the reason why it's so special is that these spear points were actually embedded in the, here he is out at this canyon where he was checking after the flood, by the way. And so sticking out of that sort of stream bank is where he found these really weird spear points, which he had never seen before. But the key is that they were embedded in the bones of an ancient animal. He didn't know what kind of animal, but he knew it was significant enough, so he started writing letters. He wrote letters to the people in Denver, Colorado, 3 or 4 hours to the north, at the Museum of Science, and said, hey, I got this really cool spear point, and it's in the middle of some rib bones. Maybe you guys want to come down and check this out. And they kind of just blew him off. They're like, man, you don't know what you're talking about, And he tried writing letters to others. He tried writing letters to the archaeologists at Harvard University and all these places. So a few people listened to him. However, a few years after the fact, his discovery made some pretty big waves. People then became more aware that what he had found was actually hugely, hugely interesting. Sadly, George McJunkin didn't live very long, and he passed away. And so a lot of sort of his, his credit in this discovery, wasn't realized until many years later. But soon enough, those same archaeologists from Denver and Harvard got wind of this site. They came down and they actually started digging here. And it's like, oh my God, this is incredible. This is one of the few sites at that time that had ever been discovered that conclusively had evidence of humans with extinct Ice Age animals. In this case, that's an extinct bison, Bison antiquus. Now, they did not have radiometric carbon dating in like 1907. So they couldn't know exactly when these were laid down, and they wouldn't know for probably a few decades more. Here's some of those archaeologists that have come out. These are some notable, massive worldwide paleontologists and archaeologists, because this is both a paleontological site and an archaeological site. And here they are digging sort of in the context of the site back in September of 1927. This is what so this is the site here that's called we're going to call Folsom Points. Let's write this down. I've already thrown out a few names. Let's talk about Folsom, which is named for the nearby town of Folsom, New Mexico. And if you're following along sort of geographically, here's New Mexico here. There's the Four Corners region, Colorado. And Folsom is kind of like right up here. And that's where George McJunkin found this first spear point. Now, a few years later, after George McJunkin finds this point, someone else is down here, not too far across from North Texas, near Clovis, New Mexico. So here's Folsom, and here's Clovis. This guy down in Clovis is reading the newspaper about George McJunkin's discovery near Folsom. And he's like, man, I like stone spear points. I like finding bones. I think I'm going to go back out to the arroyo, which is a canyon behind my house, and I'm going to start looking for things too. And so he's back there kind of messing around, and lo and behold, in the side of this ditch, he finds spear points and is like, wow, whoa, great discovery. So he also reaches out and gets people interested, and people from Harvard come and so forth, right? And so here's some of those points, and they're a little bit longer and they're a little bit differently shaped. Now, again, no one knows at this time period how old these things are. They have their suspicions, but they don't conclusively know. And they won't know for probably another couple of decades when carbon dating becomes a thing. And it's going to take literally almost a century, by the way, for scientists, archaeologists to piece this story back together. All right. Now, as they start digging at this site at Clovis, New Mexico, here's what they find. In the same layers, they go up in these. So remember, deeper in the soil means older. Upwards means more young, recent. As they find Clovis here, they start digging around. They go up just a little bit. They found Folsom points, which have been found up in northern New Mexico. And so these are at different points in the layers. They found Clovis points down here and Folsom points up here, okay? And by the time we get to the mid-1900s, late 1900s, people now have the stratigraphic context, right? The layers figured out. And they're able to put carbon dating to these things. And that's when they realize, wow, these are really old. These are not 3,000 or 4,000 years old. Folsom points by themselves are 9,500 to 10,900 years old. Clovis points are 12,800 to 13,500 years old. So radiometric dating of the sediments of the biological material and the sediments around these spear points allows us to sort of understand the cultures of the people and the time periods in which they lived. But if we didn't have these spear points, we would never know they were here to begin with, because their villages don't preserve. Their spear point, the wooden spear handles don't preserve. The baskets that they made generally don't preserve. All the other things of their lives. Think about your house site, right? How much of your stuff gets thrown away upon your death? How much of your stuff will actually be here 10,000 years from now? How much of the trash that has somehow blown out of your back of your truck or blown out of your yard from your kids, or a child's play toy, a little toy? They didn't have plastic in these days, right? How much of that's going to be here 10,000 years from now? And you can see just how rare it is to have these kind of artifacts be preserved through the course of time. But these stone spear points are an amazing way to track people through time, both through the technological evolution of these stone tools and the specific age of these stone tools. But as I'm going to show you, we're going to get so much more information out of this. Can you believe that with stone tool technology, people have actually been able to reconstruct the migration patterns of caribou in Illinois during the Ice Age just by studying stone tools? All right, now let's introduce that other term, which is the one I hit you with first, which is called pre-Clovis. And the reason I didn't give them to you that way to start is that Folsom was discovered first, even though it's the youngest of these three. Then Clovis was discovered. Then we got all the way into the late part of the 20th century before people said, wait a minute. Because a lot of people were thinking Clovis were the first people to come from Siberia. They said, wait a minute, that doesn't really comport. Something doesn't make sense. There are even older stone tools that go back that are of a different technology that are older than 13,500 years, in some cases back as old as 20,000. They're a little bit more rudimentary. Let's call these pre-Clovis. So that's the different major early sort of stone tool architectural types that we're dealing with for some parts of the country. Here's how this all begins to map out with sort of this little schematic here. And you can just kind of see the relevance of these different layers, right? The further back in time you go, maybe you have pieces of the basket fragments or stone arrow points or that turkey bone awl that we showed here. Maybe some pottery fragments. Then you've got a layer of just sand and gravel without much in it. Up above, totally different cultural period. We've got bullets and shell buttons indicating different kinds of cultures and technology. The introduction of glass and metal, all these indicate. And then we're at the modern record with trash like aluminum cans and old license plates and a plastic cone. These are very important for understanding the ecological context that people are living in. And what I want to help you do through this lecture today and next week is to show the human connection to the ecosystems that we all experience here today. Okay? One last thing on this slide. The examples I just gave you of pre-Clovis, Clovis, and Folsom largely apply to like New Mexico, Arizona. Let's bring it over here to the Tennessee, Alabama, Kentucky region.
Perfect.
Yeah.
Just make perfect.
Yeah.
Pre-Clovis people make pre-Clovis points. Clovis people make Clovis points. Paleo-Indian people make Folsom points.
Oh, sorry. Yeah, good point. That's a little unclear the way I present that. Let me put it to you this way. Basically, everybody who lives, we're going to call Paleo-Indians. Paleo-Indians start with pre-Clovis. Yeah, that's not set up that well. Then Clovis. And then once we get to the Folsom points, we're kind of hitting that divide probably between Paleo-Indian and Archaic, somewhere right in there. So the Archaic period is going to pick up next. Thanks for questioning that. The Folsom is somewhere here. We don't talk a lot about Folsom in the east because there are no Folsom points east of the Mississippi. That's one reason why I'm a little bit. But what I want to do now, let's bring it over to the east. So we do have pre-Clovis, very rare in the east, almost non-existent, except for places like one side in Virginia, one side in Florida. Otherwise, pre-Clovis is almost missing from the east. What does that mean? Well, that may mean that there were no pre-Clovis cultures here 14,000 years ago, prior to the Clovis culture. Okay, or they're so low population numbers that we just have a hard time finding their sites where they may have killed animals or had villages. So there could be pre-Clovis. It's so rare on the landscape, we just may not be able to find it yet, or it may take another 100 years to find conclusive evidence. We have lots of Clovis records. So conclusively, what that means is we had lots of Clovis people here between 11,500 and 10,800 years ago. Now, here in the east, in Tennessee, Kentucky, and Alabama, in Mississippi and southern Ohio, we begin to see this evolution of spear point technologies. And what we now know is that that spear point evolution is correlated with different technological advancements. I'll explain those through the rest of this lecture. And it's correlated with different points in time. So these Clovis points that are the oldest begin to morph into shorter points by about 10,500 years ago. Notice they're still preserving this sort of parallel sides and this notched base, right? That preserves through this all the way up until about 10,000 years ago. But then we see this distinctive transition in the technology where they have this basal flange with these side notches that develops, right? And you see it beginning to emerge like right here a little bit. So there's a transition to that. And then the newest points have like these definite stems here. But still, we're at 8,000 years old. What I want to ask you the question of is, why are we seeing those transitions of stone tool technologies? Chase? Okay, so we think about how that spear point is connected to a piece of wood.
I think remember, I watched some theory where they put the food in the bottom of it.
Mm-hmm.
There's a great risk of breaking the arrow head in the process of doing that.
Gotcha.
It's a very big risk of snapping. See this bottom, and it's very common to snap. When you
Okay.
do that, And also they would split the shaft in theory to fix it on. Was when they transferred, I believe they started actually carving the groove into it, setting it in.
So what Chase is, I think, describing is the way the spear point is connected to a piece of wood. So from a mechanical sort of perspective, like you might want to attach it in a way that allows that tool to be actually useful, right? But there's a biological reason, which is what I'm trying to dig at here. There's a biological reason as well as a technological one for the changeover from these long, robust spear points that are the length of your hand to smaller spear points as we go forward in time. Matthew?
That area, like 10,500 to 10,000, is that when they think the bow and arrow was invented by Native Americans?
All right, now you're going in the right direction. It still has not been invented yet. So we got to get all the way up into the like 2,000 or 3,000 year point probably before we start to see bow and arrow technologies. So we have a long period with no bow and arrows in America. Say again? We have atlatls are in development, Brandon.
Because they were hunting smaller animals.
Yes.
Exactly. Yeah, we got big animals here, presumably. Right now, there's very little evidence in the Southeast of demonstrated kill sites of Native Americans slaughtering mammoths and mastodons and horses and camels and stuff. That's the holy grail. And while we have evidence of that in other parts of the country, we don't really have it here conclusively in some areas. Now, let me correct that a little bit. At Page Ladson in Florida, and there's a place called Cactus Hill in Virginia, people I think are pretty clear that there's some evidence of that. But there's a lot of people that still debate the validity of that archaeological evidence. So I think that's a real hot issue. I think it very likely we did have Native Americans here butchering and slaughtering Pleistocene animals. But what we do know is that, yeah, these were probably being used to kill bigger game, like bison, elk, and deer. And that as we're transitioning out, these could have still been killing deer, but more efficiently maybe using, atlatls instead of spears, right? You can actually throw an atlatl. But by the time we get on up into the more recent times of 2,000 or 1,500 years, we're talking about really tiny points that are clearly from bow and arrow technology, partly in response to the fact that the animal communities are changing. We're losing the big animals as we are shifting in our animal communities. So from these spear point technologies, we can see that change. And what is that tracking? That's tracking the impacts of humans to the land, right? It's tracking the impact of humans to species and to the landscapes around the ecosystems. Okay, in a sort of hypothetical stratigraphic arrangement, again, thinking about these stratigraphic layers, there's a point at which you can get down below where it's what we call archaeologically sterile. There's no evidence of human life, in the region below a certain point. Then we may get to a point at which there's a Paleo-Indian layer, again, dating from like 9,000 to 13,000 years. Then we get into that archaic period. These have been differentiated by archaeologists into early, middle, and late phases. Then we can get all the way up into sort of the modern day woodland Mississippi. So there are sites, like for example, out near the Tennessee River, you can find a cornfield above, let's say, adjacent to the Duck River. If you were to dig down in that cornfield and do an archaeological excavation, you very likely could get back and say a meter or 2 meters below the surface. You could get back into Paleo-Indian culture. You may have at the surface the woodland Mississippian culture. So you find these overlays that archaeologists can study at the same site by doing these archaeological digs. You can see how different cultures are shifting through different points in time. Now, this particular thing, and then we're going to take a break, brings back one of the last key points we were mentioning during the Pleistocene, which is the Younger Dryas cooling period. And that is the time period, this boundary layer, the Younger Dryas, is the boundary layer in which most of our big animals went extinct. They were completely gone by like 13,700 years ago. And we don't know the exact reasons why, but that's a really significant sort of chronological marker there. All right, let me give you one last talking point, and then we're gonna take a break, and that's a good natural sort of transition point. Remember that I told you that studying stone tools can begin to reveal really cool different kinds of information. Okay, we just showed how we can see possible patterns in human migration. By studying stone tools, we might be able to determine, based on the technological styles alone, whether there was one pattern of migration or two or three multiple waves of migration. Okay. We've also indicated where by studying stone tools, we might be able to see the evolution of smaller game species available to those hunters, going from big game to increasingly smaller animals. Right? That's reflected in that in the smaller stone tool size. But another thing becomes very important, and that is trade networks. So archaeologists they work with geologists to be able to pinpoint exactly where these rocks come from. That's pretty cool cross-disciplinary stuff, right? So this shows a collection of Clovis age spear points from the probably 10,000 to 12,000 year old time frame from Illinois. And some of these also come from Wisconsin, southern Indiana, and adjacent Missouri. Just take a look and appreciate how those lovely different colors and different arrangements, but they're all pretty obviously the same kind of general style, technological style. These are all fluted points, so they look like they've got sort of a thumbprint there, and they've got that sort of the base there that is sort of incised there. So what researchers have been able to do is to sample the elemental composition of each stone, and they can tell how much silica is in it, and how much quartz crystals, and how much of a different type of element are in that. And then what they can do is identify the exact rock layers and where those stone tools were likely quarried from originally by Native Americans. Some of these quarry sites are well known to archaeologists. So here's 12 different types that correspond to some of those images you see on the right. And these are known quarry sites for specific types of stones. So they can pinpoint where those come from. Now, imagine if you know where the stones originated from, but what happens if you found the stone 500 miles away from where it actually comes from? Then you ask questions, well, how did it get 500 miles away where that stone is not known to occur, right? So if this red type, for example, here, this beautiful red type, what if it's only known to occur, that rock layer is only known to occur in central Wisconsin? But yet, what if it's found in southern Illinois? Well, it means that a human had to have carried it from Wisconsin to Illinois. And the question is, why? Why did humans carry it 10,000 years ago? Well, they could have been nomadic. It could have been just moving campsites or village sites. It could have been trading these things. By the way, a lot of the bigger, fancier, really elaborate spear points are thought to have been purely for ceremonial and trade purposes. They didn't even use them for hunting. They were just so cool to look at, they would use them as trade goods. They're really big pieces. So from this evidence, some PhD researchers in Illinois have tracked these different stone types and have been able to determine that there are largely two very consistent patterns that have emerged. There's a general pattern of exchange of rocks across southern and central Illinois and Indiana. So these are the quarry sites where those stones originate from, right here. This shows how far those stone tools were carried from that individual quarry location. Okay. So what this reveals is a complex network of Native Americans from the Clovis era taking those stone tools kind of back and forth within this circuit. Likewise, these people are more up in northern Illinois and Wisconsin, pretty close to where the ice Ice Age glaciers would have come to, just a little bit right in this region. And they're taking their stone tools, in some cases, really long distances, all the way down to the Ohio River. So it begs the question of why are they doing that? One speculation that has begun to emerge, we don't have the time to get into all of it, is that they were following herds of caribou, which of course no longer live in Illinois, right? They were Ice Age animals. Today they live in far northern Canada and Alaska. But 13,000 years ago, the glaciers were right up here near the Canadian border, meaning that a lot of this was still tundra. So it would be very much like northern Canada is today. So the thought is that these caribous were undergoing their annual migrations, and these Native Americans were nomadically following them and hunting them, and of course, leaving those stones behind that we can study and evaluate today. All right, next what I want to do is briefly, like in 5 minutes or less, just recap one segment of a few slides from before spring break. We talked about what life was like during the Ice Age, just to kind of as a jumping off point for what life was like for these Clovis people, and what may have been like as well for the early archaic Native Americans. Remember that by this point in time, and this is showing around 11,000 years ago. So that last example we're talking about of, migrating herds of caribou in parts of Illinois and Wisconsin, this is what that land would have probably looked like at about that time. You would have the Great Lakes just coming into existence with a lot of glacial meltwater. You could see the precursor here to Lake Michigan, for example. You have large retreating continental glaciers to the north. And then as those are melting, the rivers are very large, very swollen, with lots of ice and chunks of logs and stones rafting and ripping down down these rivers. And then as all that melting is happening, of course, sea levels are rising as well. A big key point is the amount of landscape changeover that's happening during this time frame. If you go back here, you can see some ages that are put on these different maps. So this map on the left shows kind of what conditions would have been like at the full height of the, or not quite the full height, but as the glaciers were growing, they won't reach their full height until about 18,000 years ago. So they're still kind of growing at 28 to 25,000 years ago. By 18,000 years ago, the glaciers have reached their glacial maximum. Farther south are going to come during this last period. And then I want you to think about how the vegetation is shifting ahead of those glaciers. Okay. And so just a brief recap, we have a zone of tundra right in front of the ice. You can see that represented by the orange here. Okay, notice how that changes over about a 10,000 year period with respect to where tundra is. In fact, here it's not really changing all that much, right? The biggest thing is that as the Ice Age continues to advance and the glaciers push even farther south, tundra basically comes down the mountains of the Appalachian Mountains to the high elevations. Notice then we also have these other zones. So like this taiga, which is this coniferous forest of spruce and fir and jack pine. This is like a lot of Christmas tree type trees through here, evergreen conifers. Notice where that is by the full glacier. It's moved even farther south and is well over the Tennessee region, would be mostly taiga, according to this one particular model. Deciduous forest, like we have today here in Tennessee, was actually still quite common just before the height of the glaciation. By the time we get into glaciation, though, those deciduous forests had largely been pushed south, we think, into parts of Mississippi and Alabama, northern Florida, and Georgia. And then again, you can see this sort of associated shift southward of these vegetation types. Notice that the yellows here would be grassland. You can see grassland here and so forth. Now, these are just models. They obviously represent hypotheses based on accumulations of various data points. What we cannot say with certainty is that this is exactly the way it was. And we know there are a lot of gaps and a lot of biases with this information. So I don't want to focus on too much the nitty-gritty details as much as the major patterns, which is the shift in vegetation that we're seeing in response to cooling and warming. So this is what we think parts of eastern North America would have looked like in our region, possibly boreal, coniferous forest. Now let's go forward and look at two more points in time. Let's look at 13,000 years ago and 11,000 years ago. Okay, these points in time span what we call the Younger Dryas cooling period. So at 13,000, we're still firmly within the recognized boundary of the Pleistocene. This is part of the Pleistocene. The glaciers are still pretty far south, down to about where the Great Lakes are. And you can see that even by 13,000 years ago, things are still kind of like they were here 5,000 years earlier during the height of the Ice Age, right? We still have glacier, we still have taiga, we still have some residual tundra on the high mountains of the Appalachians. And then the tundra is becoming more fragmented in the north as it retreats with the glaciers. The boreal forest is beginning to shift back to the north. And then the temperate forest is beginning to push back north into Tennessee and into Kentucky and Alabama a little bit more prominent. And about probably between 13 and 12,000 years ago, that we hit this cool down period where it gets cooler, distinctly drier, and that's what we call the Younger Dryas. That's that point in time where several things happen at once. We lose all our big animals. Finally, they're gone. We got a lot of people moving in, as evidenced by projectile points, Clovis points, right? There are lots of people here now. We have platinum deposits. What does that seem to indicate? Platinum sphericals. What is that? Yeah, possible meteor impact from the same period up in the Greenland, northern Canada area. So all those combined, along with very obvious major environmental change, is what is leading some people to say that's what caused the extinction of these Ice Age megafauna. Now, once we get past this period and those Ice Age megafauna go extinct, we have mostly smaller species like white-tailed deer, we have elk, we have moose still, we have bison, we have beaver, we have wolves and foxes and all those things that we're accustomed to these days in North America. This is what life is like, or vegetation was like in about 11,000 years ago. Notice that the taiga has pulled mostly up into the Great Lakes at this point. A lot of our coniferous forest has retreated to the north. We've lost our tundra entirely from the south on the tops of the high mountains of the Blue Ridge. And the forest is predominantly kind of what you see around us today, oaks and hickories and elm trees and hornbeams and maples and those kind of things. So it's mostly a temperate forest. Now, notice though, this bias against grassland. Most people have always said, oh, the grasslands were always pretty much in the center of the continent. And there's been no room in these paleo vegetation models for suggesting grasslands were anywhere in Tennessee or Ohio or Virginia or New York. And I think that's a gross oversimplification to say, it was all forest. It was all forest 11,000 years ago. Don't worry about it. It was all forest 15,000 years ago. Don't worry about it. It was all forest 18,000 years ago. Don't worry about it. But at what point during the previous 2 months, as we've been going through all the animals that lived in Tennessee, does that comport with what you know from the Great Fossil Site? What about all that rich array of megafauna that lived in the Pliocene and the Miocene? I mean, some of those were grassland obligate animals, pronghorns, American cheetah. Is that American cheetah going to approach 60 miles per hour in a forest? I don't think so, right? So I want you to know these models for what they are, which are speculation. They are hypotheses, and there's a lot of data to support them. You just need to know that the data that we have to build these models comes almost exclusively from what types of habitats. How do we get these models to begin with? Coring ponds, right? They come from wetlands. They come from the wettest, swampiest places that we have, bogs and swamps and natural ponds and natural lakes. The dry habitats, the grasslands, the open savannas don't preserve these records very well. So we don't have really any way to conclusively say what was grassland or not. But clearly this contradicts the animal fossil record of things like cheetahs from Southwest Virginia and mammoths from Southwest Virginia and horses from Nashville and so forth. Otherwise, what do you have to do? You basically have to say, all those animals were forest adapted. And believe it or not, that's what a lot of paleontologists have done. They said, the overwhelming majority of scientists and archaeologists have fallen into the trap of believing everything in the East was forest. Everything in the East was woodland. And so when they find a grassland adapted species for the East, they try to twist themselves in knots to invoke, well, must have been a forest adapted caribou. This was a forest adapted bison. This is a forest adapted whatever, right? We don't have to go there. We don't even have to invoke that. Why? Because we have a long legacy of grasslands being in the East. And we'll get to that a little bit more in depth as we go. Okay. So the Younger Dryas is this really important period of dramatic cooling, cooling and drying. Excuse me. And it occurred right at the boundary between the Pleistocene and the Holocene. But it also occurred at the boundary between two Native American cultural groups, the Paleo Indians, which we've already talked about with their Clovis points, and the next group that comes after that, which are the Archaic Indians. And this is not just one monolithic group, right? This wasn't like a single tribe. This was an entire cultural sort of expression that really sort of picks up at around 10,000 years ago and progresses all the way up into probably around 6,000 or 7,000, maybe 5,000 years ago. So as we are becoming less and less glaciated and it's warmer and warmer, we then begin to see, here we are at 8,000 years ago on the left, and this is the present vegetation here on the right. Now, you'll notice, again, all the models have suggested everything essentially east of the Mississippi is forest or woodland, and that all the grassland models show prairies as basically inhabiting the Great Plains where we all know and love them today. Okay? These models, again, are overly simplistic, overreaching, and leave a lot to be desired. And we're going to get more and more into that in a bit. We've already talked about all the extinctions and why they might have gone extinct. I'm gonna hit this one last time. By the way, some of this will be on the final exam. This particular thing is on the final because we've covered it in a previous lecture. And I want to make sure I kind of just hit it one more time. This really excellent study is focused on that period of time right there when all this environmental change is taking place. Okay, so right around that sort of 13,000 year mark. This is a paper published in Science in 2009, and it looks at pollen sites from these wetlands where they, recovered spruce pollen, and there's some pine pollen. Here's oak pollen, and this is what we call NAP or non-arboreal, meaning non-tree pollen. This is like wildflowers, grasses and sedges and stuff like that. Here are ash trees. These are hop hornbeam and hornbeam trees. And then we get into a different set of categories. We have animal dung spores from megafauna called Sporomyella. And then I don't know what this one is, but then we have charcoal. Okay, so here's the key points I want you to take away. Three key things. Number one, remember all that, the plant change we've just been highlighting with those maps, right? We're saying we went from taiga to deciduous forest, right? Coniferous forest to deciduous forest. That tracks out right here with this graph because spruce trees are part of the taiga vegetation. That's a dominant type tree, right? It's like one of those Christmas trees. And it's present from 16.5 thousand years ago in abundance. This is the amount of pollen in that sample, all the way up until about 11,500. When we get to the Younger Dryas, it collapses. And it's gone by just after 10,000 years, more or less. But notice oak pollen. Oaks, which are part of the deciduous forest region to the south, are present in very small abundances at 13,000 years, and then they spike after the Younger Dryas, and we get firmly into the Holocene at 11,000 years ago. Oak explodes. That clearly shows the complete ecosystem transition from a taiga-dominated site, that's as one pond, from taiga to deciduous forest in just a few thousand years. Now, think about the environmental impacts to animals and food webs and trophic systems, right? Two last key points. If there's a lot of animals, there's a lot of poop. There's a watering hole, the big animals are going to be there, right? Mastodons and horses and camels and musk oxen. Look at how much fungal dung spores are present. Sporomyella, Sporomyella. Sporomyella is very high up until here. At about 13,700 is when the big animals go extinct in North America. And at that point, the animal dung levels are very low, probably coinciding with the major species you would expect today. Maybe bison, maybe elk, maybe deer, right? And when those animals are prevalent on the landscape, the big animals are eating stuff, right? They're grazing, they're foraging, they're browsing. The more animals, the more they're grazing, the more they're browsing, the less fuel there is for burning wildfires. Wildfires need fine fuels like grasses to spread through, right? So the less fire you have, the more animals you have, the less fuel, the less fire. Look how little charcoal is present while the animals are around, right? But when the animals disappear, the charcoal spikes and becomes very abundant. So those are three key things I want you to think about. At the Younger Dryas boundary between the Paleo-Indians and the Archaic, we have major shifts in vegetation from taiga to deciduous forest, or possibly grassland too. Again, we don't know the grassland part because of the biases in the record. We have major shifts in animal dung spores, and we have major shifts in the abundance of charcoal, okay? Okay, so now let's focus on the Archaic cultural period. This is roughly from 11,000 to 450 years ago, all the way up to about 3,200 years before present. The Archaic Indians largely were without big animals around. There's a lot of debate about whether there were bison in this part of the world at this period. Many people say there were no bison in Tennessee. When you go back to the Ice Age, yes, we had bison, latifrons, the longhorn bison, bison in Antiquus. But in terms of modern bison, like you see on the Great Plains, many people say there are no records of bison in Tennessee, period, after the Ice Age. In fact, the only record of bison is from a cave here in Clarksville, Dunbar Cave. There's a couple bones that are about 1,000 years old, suggesting that bison was absent from the region, whereas things like elk and deer were prevalent. And we're going to talk about how we know that in a bit. But it's thought that white-tailed deer was the big game animal around here that was preferred by Native Americans, and probably not even elk. Elk were abundant, I'm sure they were here, but elk oftentimes was not favored because its hide is very coarse, so it was not favored for rugs and clothing. It's a very heavy animal too. And I guess the meat probably, I actually think elk is the most delicious meat I've ever had personally. But white-tailed deer was so much more abundant. Its hide was so much more pliable, softer, versatile, and it was used for everything. So white-tailed deer became the staple go-to animal for many, many of the needs of Native Americans. Likewise, hickory nuts was one of the most preferred food sources for Native Americans during the Archaic period. And we should expect to see a lot of hickories because wherever you have oak trees, you have hickory trees. And seeing that transition from a coniferous forest into a deciduous forest with oak and hickory being dominant, we see a lot of hickories coming on into this region. So hickory nuts, how many of you ever had hickory nuts, by the way? Raise your hand. Oh man, there's probably 7 or 8 species in the area. Most of them have very good sweet nuts. There's a very prevalent in the archaeological record. All right, let's go back to the projectile points for a minute. Because now that we have gone from the Clovis, which is a part of the Paleo-Indian period, into the Archaic, we're in this what's called post-Clovis or the Archaic. Remember when I showed you that map that showed all those Clovis points all over the eastern U.S. and there was these big orange circles over Tennessee, Kentucky, right? Indicate a lot of Clovis points in this region. And you can look at the relative number of points. A large number of Clovis points have been found, again, dating to about 13 to 12,000 years. But then there's a notable drop in the relative abundances of the spear points that come just after Clovis. So lots of Clovis points here, but fairly few by comparison of these younger projectile points, like the Beaver Lake and the Quad points or the Daltons. These are rarer on the landscape. These have been found less frequently. Then as you go recent in time to these, you find a lot of these on the landscape. And as you go even more recent in time, you find a bunch of these on the landscape. The implication then is that there might have been some type of reset in Native Americans and in their technology, which caused them to shift dramatically into a new projectile technology, moving from one that was, say, fitted onto the tip of a spear point, maybe to one that had this sort of side notching, right? And actually, this is the Dalton. So we're talking about, this is the technology with the major spike. These are the types that are less frequent right here. What does all this mean? Well, here again are the Clovis points, the relative densities. And here are some of those that are a little bit later that are less common. You can kind of see them over here on the left, the different names. By the way, those are all the Folsom points out there in red. Let's focus on this for just a little bit. So the idea then is that at late Paleo-Indian times, when you have Clovis points, probably hunting larger game, by the time we get into these early Archaic points, we see notice this right here. There's a big spike in the preference for hunting deer. This probably is correlated with that sort of transition from the Clovis technology to these later Archaic technologies that have a different sort of arrangement, a different, smaller and a different way that they're hafted onto the weapons that are being used to hunt these animals. There's also a reliance here on many smaller species such as squirrels, as well as on turtles and tortoises and various types of birds. So progressively, as we go forward, there's going to be smaller and smaller points that are designed to hunt these smaller game species. What does this show? It basically shows that the technology is following these trends in preferences for game through time, okay? Especially with deer and smaller species.
I got a question.
Yeah, Laura, go ahead.
So I love the turtles, right? And I see their spike and then their fall. And we don't trace that through spear point records, right?
No, not right.
Okay.
Right. Yeah, really, this is more about just the deer on this particular graph.
Okay, all right. Thanks. Silly question, but
Yeah, no, it's a good question because I'm not sure I made that point exactly. I'm glad you clarified. So what's the key point of this graph? Spear point technology is changing largely because animals are getting smaller, and the preference in the variety for different wildlife is increasing. Instead of focusing on just a few large species, there's a preference for focusing on a variety of types of animals, including deer, turtles and tortoises, not tortoises, but turtles, box turtles, snapping turtles, etc., squirrels, and a variety of small birds, large birds like turkey especially. But we can also look to the archaeological record to get a full appreciation for the diets of Native Americans. And this is really revealing when we start to study what has been recovered for some sites. Let's take a look. This is a site that bridges the late Paleo-Indian period into the Archaic period. It's a cave in Alabama, near Florence, Alabama, called Dust Cave. And from these cave deposits, all of these animals have been recovered. Let's just take a look and see what it reveals about this kind of a landscape. I'm going to go quickly through them from the top. Opossum, shrews, short-tailed shrew, moles, eastern moles, bats, raccoons, weasels, skunks, and mink. Striped skunk, dogs, wolves, coyotes, foxes. Again, sometimes they have to assign things to broad categories because they may not have conclusive evidence of which one it is. Red fox, gray fox, eastern chipmunk, woodchuck, squirrels, gray squirrel, eastern fox squirrel, beaver, mice, rats, voles, white-footed deer mice, eastern wood rat, voles, muskrat, rabbits, eastern cottontail, swamp rabbit, white-tailed deer, waterfowl, geese, diving ducks, snow goose, Canada goose, marsh ducks, mallards, turkeys, pheasants, and prairie chickens. We don't have pheasants in North America. Prairie chickens. More prairie chicken remains, bobwhite, which is northern bobwhite quail, hawks, and eagles. That's a hell of a variety of animals that are found in these archaeological remains from these groups of people living in northwestern Alabama. That shows a huge variation in their diet, right? So they are not feeding just on whitetail or just on large species. By the way, what's missing here? What are they not feeding on from the late Paleo-Indian period? There's no megafauna in this record, right? None. And what else is missing that you might have expected to see? Oh, yeah. And by the way, I'm sure there's no evidence of bison in this record. These are just the mammals. So, and the birds. I do have some other I have some others where they definitely show the snakes and the turtles and stuff and fish. They were eating a wide variety of all those groups, mussels as well. But there's no evidence of bison in these particular records. And there's no elk in these records, which I think is interesting as well. Now, there are elk records in other archaeological remains from different published studies, but no bison. So let's talk about that, for example. Sort of the bison conundrum. Where did they go? And where are they really missing all along? These are important questions. If we look at the paleontological record, we definitely have bison remains prior to the Younger Dryas into the late Ice Age from many sites. I mean, just pick up your book, right? Your textbook. It shows bison bones from Alabama and so. I mean, there's a lot of bison fossils from the South. But from 12,000 years ago, all the way up to about the year 1500, 500 years ago, we don't have any bison except for that one bone found in Dunbar Cave that's roughly 1,000 years old. So what that means is, where were bison in the Mid-South? Where was our biggest mammal of North America? Where was it? Was it only in the Great Plains? Or do we also have bison? Any thoughts on that?
Was here, it was potentially being hunted by the people. There was a similar cultural notion to our more recent Native Americans, like use every part of the animal. Like, that was in play. Potentially they're relocating, destroying bones and skeletons and things, not leaving them out on the landscape should be preserved, so.
So it could be that squirrels have devastated all the bison remains, right? They like to chew on stuff, right? I used to like to go hunt for deer antlers after the deer would drop them every year. And hunt for the shed antlers, it's called the sheds. And I would rarely find them, but when I did, invariably they would all often have gnaw marks on them where the mice and rodents have been chewing them for their teeth. So it could be that rodents just took care of all the remains of any bison, but you know, or what were you going for, Clayton? Basically saying maybe they preferentially just didn't hunt bison during that time. Is that what you were saying?
Well, they were hunting them, but they could be using the bones or making them archaeologically irretrievable in some way.
Okay. So for some reason, they're not present in the archaeological record. But I promise you, you can go out on the landscape. Theo could probably testify to this. You can talk to any number of conservation organizations and they'll say, we didn't have buffalo here. There were no bison in Tennessee. I'm like, wait a minute. We clearly have written records of lots of bison from 1780, 1770. There's a family here in Clarksville. Their family came here in the 1780s. And they have a pair of bison hide gloves that are now in the Customs House Museum in Clarksville, passed down from when their family first got here and there were bison. So there's clear archaeological and other types of evidence that bison were present. Dunbar Cave, in fact, was known as Buffalo Cave before it became renamed as Dunbar Cave. Okay?
But if you just isolate populations where they weren't as much of a hunting, like maybe the grasslands shrank in certain areas, so certain regions went to level out.
You could have had just very isolated populations such that, you know, population density was low and therefore fossilization was very low. Maybe you don't see any, right? Okay, any other possible scenarios to explain the apparent gap in bison here in the Mid-South?
I mean, if I had to hunt that for a deer, it'd be like, I'll just take these.
Yeah. Right. Okay.
Nothing to prove.
Well, now what I'm about to tell you is a little bit, it's published, peer-reviewed science, but I have since talked to one of North America's leading bison experts, Dr. Chris Widga, who is a bison paleontologist. He cast doubt on the study that I'm about to show you. I'm gonna teach it to you so you'll know the controversy, right? And if you're interested, you can dig further and read on it. I'm going to talk to you about a study recently published by Dr. Christopher Moore and colleagues from Eastern Carolina University. Chris Moore is an archaeologist who has been studying some sites in the Piedmont, y'all know where that's at, of South Carolina, right at the fall line. And these are sites that straddle the Paleo-Indian to Archaic Indian boundary. And this is a graph that shows some of those sites from the study area. These are the archaeological dig sites, and so they're getting all kinds of things from here. They're getting rock fragments, which were used as scrapers to scrape the meat and the membranes off of hides. Here's the base of a Clovis point, right? There's all kinds of these stone tools that are being collected from these archaeological dig sites. Chris Moore and colleagues then began to borrow a technology for forensic medicine. This is what I love about this class, is we get to talk with these sort of interdisciplinary approaches. They use a technique called crossover immunoelectrophoresis. Now, they are not recovering DNA from these projectile points. They are recovering protein residues from these projectile points, but not full DNA samples. Here's how. When these stone tools are made, you mind pulling out your piece of block that you got there? Yeah. Imagine you start with a large piece of chert, right, or flint, and chipping it, and you're breaking it open. I'm going to show you what one of these looks like. It's a great, actually, yeah. So James brought in this chert nodule here. This is a mass of pure chert. Now, this particular nodule that's common around here in the rocks around Clarksville is the right kind of rock for making stone tools. It's just that this particular nodule, these nodules are not good for making stone tools. What I mean by that is this. Chert as a rock type is generally good for making stone tools. But these cherts and these nodules are not, because of the way when you start to break them, they break off in very small pieces. They don't allow you to get a big hefty piece that you can actually work with. But imagine that you did. Imagine you had a big chunk of chert, break it down, and you pop off a piece, and you continue to work it, and you're using another stone, a hammer stone, to bust it. And y'all have seen that, right? Kind of demonstrated. And then finally you get a flake off, which maybe you would use to make a knife. And then to really finalize that point, you use maybe the antler of the deer antler, the tip, to kind of really just flake off those margins to get them serrated like you need them, right? That pressuring of busting and flaking the margin creates micro fractures in the rock that allows protein residue and blood to seep into the rock fractures when they use it to butcher a deer or some other animal. What do I mean by that? I mean, if you've got a stone edge, right, and you were to magnify that edge, what is the serrated margin? It looks like it's just nice and serrated, might in fact have a bunch of sort of very minute microscopic cracks in it. That sort of these fractures on the edges. And it's in those cracks then that bits of blood and other residues get trapped in there through capillary action. They get sort of pulled in. It's not enough to extract DNA from, but it is enough to determine what type of protein residues are there. And here's where this is important. We can actually identify the protein residues according to which major animal group that they're from. Canine residues are different from human residues. Human residues are different than bovine or cows. And by the way, bovine also includes things like yaks and buffalo, bison. These are different from cats or felines, so the mountain lions and so for bobcats. Turkeys have different residues. Notice that here we have a prairie chicken, right? They have a different residue from a turkey. And so by looking at these residues, we can then study these stone tools in new ways to look at the dietary preferences of the Native Americans using these stone tools between the Archaic and Paleo-Indian periods. Is that pretty cool or what? Well, let's see what the data reveal. So here's the archaeological site, and you can see that they've sampled different places here. Here's some turkey that's been collected from here. There is Galliformes, which is the group of birds that includes things like prairie chickens. We have deer and bison, or again, bovids specifically, bovines, but they're inferring that these are probably bison. Here's a chronology of these records. So here's the different spear point technologies. Clovis point, right? Pretty clearly. And coming more recently, remember how we showed the evolution of those? That's why I started with that as part of the lecture. We go from the Clovis types through the Daltons to these that are sort of the side notch types here of the Archaic, into the stemmed types, progressively into smaller arrowhead types, in which arrowhead technology, bow and arrow technology, is evolving way in the recent times. By looking at the residues in these rock fragments, they can say, hey, we got one bear hit, we got 4 hits on bison, 3 hits on mountain lions, 3 hits on rabbits, 2 hits on deer. That's pretty cool. What this reveals is that we got bison from 14 to 12,000 years ago. We still have bison from 11 to 9,000 years ago. We still have bison from 8,000 up to about 7,000 years. Bison runs cold. No more bison after that. After that, we have canines and we have deer represented by the sparse sampling here. So what that means is maybe we had bison after all. This is South Carolina, right? Even farther away from the Great Plains. What does that mean about Tennessee? Well, to my knowledge, no one has studied protein residues from projectile points from Tennessee or Kentucky or in other places. So it could be, in many ways, this could really overturn what we have thought about. I mean, Theo, how many times have you run into somebody who says, there's been no bison here since the Ice Age? That's a common talking point. East of the Mississippi, yeah. And I forget, you're from west of the Mississippi, so. Yeah. Okay. All right. Now, we can't solve that problem, right? But I just want to teach you about the sparsity or the lack of bison evidence. But I want to at least teach you about the possible use of forensic medicine to help get at this from a new perspective.
What was the controversy?
Well, the controversy is that if you follow Dr. Chris Whitga, he says, look, I don't believe in this protein residue business. I think it's a bunch of bunk, basically. You know, I don't think he's convinced. And so what would be ideal is to see more studies that test this independently to see if we can come up. We just need more, work, more research to get at this. But it's a brand new burgeoning area of science, and hopefully it will reveal patterns that, you know, we didn't know about 5 or 10 years ago. We're gonna introduce a new topic right now: agriculture, the origins of agriculture in the United States, in Eastern North America.
That'll be fun.
Coming up right here. All right, here we go. Okay, so I guess the take-home message from the last slide before the break was we might have had bison, we might not have had bison, right? We don't know exactly. But the next time somebody confidently says, hey, there was no bison here, there was no bison in the Holocene, you might, hey, buddy, there's some evidence to suggest that there were bison here during the early Holocene, continuously from the Ice Age into the Holocene up until 7,500 years ago from the Piedmont fall line transition area of South Carolina. But you're right, late Holocene all the way up until modern times, like 1500, not so much in the way of bison records, up until about 1,000. All right. Okay, so why is this important to the Archaic? Well, the Archaic is this period of time, again, roughly 10,000 years ago up to about 3,500 years ago. There's a notable shift during this time of using smaller side-notched stone tools. There's a definite preference for a lot of small animals and a lot of plants for food sources. We haven't talked so much about the plants, but that's what we're going to talk about now, is what were the Native Americans especially using? By the way, those lists I showed you earlier of all the animals that they were using in Paleo-Indian cave deposits, there's also a rich array of plant remains from that site. And that's a publication which, as I build the bibliography for this class, eventually I'll put all that in there. But there is a rather rich assortment of plants that they were also using, like grapes and smart weeds and all kinds of plants that we're going to talk about here shortly. Okay. With the Archaic period, one notable shift we see is that most of the remains of the Archaic become aggregated into river valleys. Okay, that's a real prevailing pattern that begins to emerge. Now, some people might say, well, what about during the Clovis period? Wasn't there also a tendency for those to be found in river valleys? Generally true. A lot of our Clovis points were found on like the terraces above a river. So not in the floodplain proper, but oftentimes where there's a little bit of a, let me show it to you like this. So imagine if you've got a river here, kind of coursing through this valley, and you've got a floodplain that periodically becomes inundated with floodwaters. And maybe there's a little bit of a rise over against the edge of that floodplain. And then it sort of goes up into the hills. A lot of our sites for both Paleo-Indian and archaic sites tend to be found on these terraces, like in these kinds of areas. And these are probably make good sense because they were elevated above floods for village sites. So the normal flood stage would be at about right there. So they couldn't have their villages be wiped out by flooding, for example, under most conditions, under most scenarios. Soils were fertile, okay? But if you were the Paleo Indians, you didn't really care about soil fertility. Why? You weren't farming yet. If you were the archaic Indians, you really weren't concerned about soil fertility in the early archaic because you weren't farming yet either. There was a hunter-gatherer, nomadic sort of subsistence culture whereby you were living by hunting and gathering and collecting things. But by the archaic, there's a transition to living specifically in river valleys. And the idea there is that this also coincides with the first ever emergence of agriculture in Eastern North America. This is really important. But how many times have you learned that in, say, a classroom where you learned about the advent of agriculture as an elementary school student, right? Where do we learn that agriculture originated? Fertile Crescent and Mesopotamia. And that's true. I mean, it originated, what, like 10,000 years ago, earlier than it did here. Sure. These are called cradles of agriculture. Like the places where plants and animals were first domesticated, these cradles of agriculture. So one is Mesopotamia, places like Iraq between the Euphrates and Tigris rivers. Where's another cradle of agriculture where plant domestication happened completely independently from what was happening in Mesopotamia?
The Nile River Valley.
Okay, Laura's saying Nile River Valley, possibly. What were you going to say, Matthew? All right. Yeah, the Nile, I can't say one way or the other. I actually never took a world history class. So those are really close, relatively speaking, to Mesopotamia. So, you know, theoretically, you could have had some cultural swap going on between the lower Nile River Valley and, let's say, parts of modern day Iraq. But certainly no cultural interchange between Central America, Mexico, and modern day Iraq, right? So that's a clear area where agriculture was completely being invented, completely independently. All right, what's at least one other region?
Really?
I think one other region, right? China? Didn't China also, wasn't there a separate invention of agriculture there? Don't hold me to that. All right, but absolutely there was a clear independent origin of agriculture in Central America and North America. All right, so the point though is there are two completely separate independent origins of agriculture, and probably there was at least a third. What was happening in Central America, probably at least at this point, may have been happening sort of independently from what was happening here in Eastern North America, in parts of Tennessee and Kentucky and Alabama. Possibly there was some interchange there, some cultural influence, but I think scholars are kind of the opinion that this was its own center of origin for Native American agriculture, was happening right here in parts of Tennessee. Let's take a look at this a bit deeper. What kind of things were going on at the Middle Archaic? So roughly 5,000–6,000 years ago that might have been paving the way for the advancement in invention of agriculture here. Number one, we had prolonged droughts that were beginning to affect this region. There's various lines of evidence for that. When Theo and I were coming up in school, we referred to this period of the mid-Holocene as the hypsothermal warming period. Okay, so let's spell that out. Hypsothermal warming period. This is the time period from roughly 4,000 to 8,000 years ago. And a lot of scholars today give it a different name, and it's called the mid-Holocene warming period. And it's got a third name, of course, everything in science has multiple names, and it's called like the Holocene climatic optimum or something crazy like that. But if you don't know it by any of those names, that's fine. Hypsothermal is still very popular in terms of sort of the older crowd. So the point is that we had lots of droughts affecting this region. Archaic cultures again become concentrated along major river valleys in the southeast. So we're having more villages concentrated in these areas, kind of like I showed here, especially on terraces. Brown and Vieira postulated that changes in stream geomorphology. This is the sculpturing and sort of remember when we talk about down cutting of streams, or what's the opposite of down cutting streams? Where streams are building up in floodplains, aggradation. And we talked about how that was connected to things like isostatic rebound, the melting of glaciers. These lands might have been aggrading instead of down cutting. Brown and Vieira postulated that changes in stream geomorphology during the mid-Holocene fostered the development of floristically diverse floodplain swamps, especially backwaters. What that means is along these streams, this particular hypothesis is now 40 years old, is speculating that changes in the streams was leading to lots of swamps developing in those floodplains. Okay, so let's say that were true. What would happen if you all of a sudden started inundating or flooding the bottomlands of these river systems and stream valleys? Before you answer that, I want you to look at the contour of the landscape that's about probably 30 or 40 miles, maybe 50 miles southwest of Clarksville. So Clarksville would be about where the ceiling is if you come down. Here's the Duck River. Here's the Buffalo River. Tennessee River is right here. Notice how hilly this landscape is and how generally forested and very dissected it is. But then look at this. All the stream valleys are open and nearly treeless. It's a very stark contrasting pattern. I'll just point that out. And these are the stream valleys that are relatively flat and even, and their rivers sort of just kind of course and meander through the bottoms of these floodplains. So if there's a lot of flooding going on and formation of swamps and backwaters, what would that do to a floodplain stream valley region? Any duck hunters in the room? No. Theo, tell us about what comes to your mind. What do you see in Arkansas in flooded environments?
In terms of animals or?
No, in terms of like, let's say, because let me step back and ask one more question. What do the vegetation models predict or show that this entire area should have been like 11,000 years ago? Forest. So the working assumption that everybody starts with is that this was all forest. But what I've clearly showed you is the modern day pattern is very stark. It's forest and non-forest. So my question to you is, when do these valleys become non-forested? Was it some point in recent time? Was it long ago? Well, what do you think the established paradigm is? If I were to just go ask a local historian or a local ecologist, what do you think their answer would be if I were to show them this map and say, when did all these creek valleys get opened up? What would the answer be 99% of the time? Yeah, first settlers got here. They went in and deforested all those valleys. Really? And they didn't deforest the uplands? Well, yeah, they did, but you see, the uplands grew back into forest. And the valleys, they deforested, and then they kept them in grassland. They kept them in like agricultural land. Oh, okay, I get it. So they put cows on them, and they might have put corn down there. That makes sense, because actually these valleys are full of corn and cows. Okay? But do they have any evidence to actually suggest that these valleys were entirely created by early white settlers, let's say between the And the question I would ask to you guys, and this is why the next lecture is coming, is when did the first white settlers who were deforesting this area, when did they get there? If you don't know, that's okay, because that's what you're going to learn about next time. But what if it wasn't the white settlers? What if it was some partial opening by the Native Americans who lived in this valley through girdling the trees, where you would take a ring of tissue off around and basically kill the trees standing? That was a common technique to kill forests, to open up more light. Maybe they did that when agriculture was getting started 2,000 years ago, 3,000, 4,000 years ago. But what if they didn't? What's another possible explanation to explain the mass opening of stream valleys in this region of the Western Highland Rim? Maybe it's floods. So Brown and Vieira, who are a couple of archaeologists, are speculating that the propensity for more flooding causing swampier habitats was changing these valleys. Let's keep reading. This set up the ability to domesticate native plants for crops. How? How does giving a bunch of swampy bottomlands make it easier to grow crops? With the cooling temperatures and the increase in moisture, rivers across the region began aggrading, or building up their floodplains rather than down cutting. We've talked about that. They were depositing more sediments as a result of more frequent flood events. Frequent flood events would have led to more ecologically diverse floodplain communities. More flooding equals more backwater swamps, more marshes, possibly drowning the existing floodplain forests that would cover the bottom. Now, I want you to think about the mental gymnastics that are starting to go on to bring forth this explanation. Okay. Yeah, okay, I see it now. I see it. Can you picture it? Yeah. Okay, yeah, I got it. The glaciers, they start melting, and the lower part of America starts rising. Yeah, it changes the stream geomorphology such that all these forests start flooding. Yeah, they start dying. You know, there's too much water. It's swampy. The trees begin to die and senesce. The floods bring more silt, and they overlay it into this floodplain. Yeah, and all of a sudden there's fertile soil and fewer trees, and there's more water, and voila, Native Americans start agriculture. Boy, that's some mental gymnastics, but not too much. We know isostatic rebound's a real thing. We can measure it. We know that aggradation is occurring. We can see it. We can measure it. So we shouldn't give those guys too hard a time. But what's missing from this consistently oversimplistic bullshit we're being fed? What's missing? I'm gonna leave you this one with you. I'm not even gonna give you any clues. The most simple explanation of all, right in front of our faces. What's a mesofauna? Yeah, how would mesofauna, like you study mesofauna, right? Give me some examples of small animals that you're studying.
Your foxes, walnuts, rabbits.
Yeah.
Basically between a coyote and
I called out a bunch of mesopaunas when I went through that list, right? I think I called out the mesofauna I'm looking for. Yeah. Beavers. Eager beavers, ecosystem engineers. So these stream floodplain environments, and there's not a damn reference in here at all from Brown and Vieira to the possibility that beavers might have had some overriding influence on manipulating this landscape. So what if we very simplistically say, hey guys, don't forget there were beavers here. And every stream in this region, in fact, was full of beavers. So full, in fact, that the very first settlers and surveyors who came to this region in the 1770s They were the first white settlers to come to this. They weren't even settlers, they were explorers and land surveyors. These are the people who gave the first English names to places. What do they call this creek? Beaver Dam Creek. And they gave those names because of the features that they observed. Sometimes they named them out of vanity for themselves or for their friends. Sometimes they named them because, hey, there's a lot of beavers on this creek. It's called a Beaver Dam Creek. Hey, there's a lot of ducks on this river. Let's call it the Duck River. Hey, there's an elk standing in the island right there. Let's call that the Elk River. That's exactly the way our rivers and streams got their names. We're going to cover that in next week's lecture. So let's keep reading one last thing. With the help of beaver, this is my language here. Many floodplain forests contain a mosaic of many floodplains likely contain a mosaic of bottomland forests, riparian woodlands, wet shrub thickets, open marshes, floodplain meadows, as well as deposits of open sand, silt, gravel, and debris from floods and bars along river courses. With the help of beaver, we add to it these other things which make sense. We already know make sense, but beaver's the missing ingredient.
I'm not seeing the connection. So how do the beavers lead to the rise of agriculture?
Oh, yeah, my friend, sure. Think about it. Well, what's the beaver's ancestor that was here during the Miocene, Pliocene, and into the early Pleistocene? The giant beaver. And there were other species of small beaver too. So not only did the beaver didn't just arrive in the Archaic, the beaver's always been here, right? The beaver's been here for 5 million years. So what I want us to always be clear about is before white settlers came in and screwed the land up through the trapping and the overexploitation of beavers, beavers were part of a healthy, functioning landscape. We look at them today as pests because they ruin private properties and they create drainage problems for lands and mess up culverts. But back in the day, they killed trees and they opened these valleys up because they had a dam every quarter mile on these creeks. And they were harvesting and gnawing and dragging and making dams, opening up these valleys. Let's take it one step further. If you have beavers doing their part to open up the landscape and create thickets and have these open beaver meadows, what might be attractive to a beaver meadow? Got some ducks. What else? What else might come down out of those hills? Deer. What might come down in those hills and forage in these terraces and bottomlands where the beavers are opening up the forests through their activity? Well, if we look at the work of Chris Moore, maybe there's a new reason to possibly look at projectile points to see if there were some big animals actually living around here instead of just the mesofauna. Maybe there are bison here too that we have never been able to detect because we haven't been looking in the right places. So if you got beaver opening up floodplains, and you got bison coming off of ridge systems down into those floodplains to preferentially graze, you got the ingredients to keep bottomlands open for thousands of years, possibly going back into the Pliocene or the Miocene. As long as we've had creek valleys, we've had beaver, we've had big animals up until the end of the Ice Age. Now we think we had them into the early Holocene. We had elk. Can you imagine all the herds of deer and elk and beaver like messing around in here together? Now imagine Native Americans populations are preferentially choosing river bottoms because their population numbers are increasing from Paleo-Indian to Archaic times. It's building the soil up, absolutely. Lots of fertile soil, right? So what's the next natural question? Does this pattern of the emergence of Native American agriculture, does it seem to correspond with these open floodplain environments? Let's take a look at what plants Native Americans were domesticated. Number one, The oldest record of domestication of sunflowers, right? Sunflower seeds, is from right here in Tennessee near Waverly. You just stopped there at a truck stop today, right? Miles away from where you were enjoying whatever food you were stuffing in your mouth. Native Americans 4,800 years ago had just started domesticating Helianthus annuus, the annual sunflower, that we today eat as sunflower seeds. That's the first ever documented occurrence of sunflower domestication. Sunflowers don't even naturally occur here, but they're weedy species that occur on gravel bars and on edges of just open, disturbed ground. Another plant that they used is the marsh elder. Look at the name, marsh. Exactly where it grows. Open, wet meadows is its preferred habitat. Gravel bars of streams is where it grows. Open, freshly flooded, silty meadows and river bottoms is where you find it in abundance. This is a huge grain crop for Native Americans, Iva annua. Another plant, lamb's quarters. This was a green that they used. Think about quinoa, a common plant, similar to that. Also, the erect knotweed. Both of these are very common species in floodplains, on gravel bars, as weeds in cornfields. That's where you find these species. Little barley. This is a grain plant. Today you find this in a variety of settings: weedy, disturbed sites, old fields. And maygrass, which is really not that common. Today this is actually quite rare. But we see this in like wet, little wet swales. So, no squashes that we know of. Yeah. Or gourds or any of those kind of plants. Yeah. So, a lot of those plants, now if you go to Alabama, you'll find them, and they're also on stream floodplain sites. Yeah. Matthew? Tobacco appears later in the agricultural record. So several innovations come later, like corn, which we get from the folks in Central America, tomatoes and other types of pumpkins, and tobacco. But these are the native plants that were domesticated in situ, basically in the site where we're talking about. And the important thing is all these domesticated plants, which are no longer being domesticated anywhere in the world, right, except for sunflower. These plants were all native, indigenous to those floodplain environments. And I would ask the question, would they have naturally sort of walked into those densely forested floodplains and sort of gotten the idea for agriculture? Or does it make more sense that those floodplains might have been a little bit more open, that there were beaver there, already easy to manipulate? I think sometimes we bend ourselves into these a million knots trying to explain something. And there's actually could be simpler models out there, like invoking beaver, for example.
They might find some products that they probably.
Yeah, right. And a lot of available niches and habitats for those. All right, let's talk about some of the other food sources for Native Americans during this period that were really important. Acorns, particularly those of white oak trees and trees in the white oak group of oaks, like post oaks and bur oaks and swamp chestnut oaks. This is a big part of the diet of Native Americans. Some oak trees, some white oaks, are found in woodlands and open forests. Some of them, however, like post oaks, are basically grasslands that have scattered trees. Other kinds of oaks, like swamp chestnut oaks, grow in sort of bottomland swamp forest type habitats. So, but oaks were a big part of the diet. Some of these were occurring in uplands that were probably very much fire dependent, grassy, open ecosystems. Let's look at the array of other kinds of foods that Native Americans relied upon. Persimmons, hawthorns, chestnuts and chinkapins, wild plums, elderberries. Oh, we got their hazelnuts. One thing they all have in common, all these species need open ecosystems. They thrive in high levels of sunlight. Some of them, like elderberry, thrive in those bottomland meadows and marshes and gravel bars in the stream valleys. Others, like persimmon trees and wild plums and crab apples, they do better in sort of more upland, open ecosystems. One thing they do not do, they do not flower or set fruit abundantly in closed forest conditions. That's a given. So I think we've, again, way overestimated the importance of closed forests. And we've underestimated because most of the food crops and wild foods that Native Americans use are in very open ecosystems naturally. Okay. So when we look at the abundance of like the stone tools plus the kinds of foods that Native Americans are utilizing, some archaeologists have attempted to kind of estimate the openness of the landscape based on that combination of data. This is going back to that Dust Cave site in Alabama. And so they looked at these different types of spear points. And then they looked at the list of species of plants and animals. And they tried to code those species as to whether they like closed forest or open grassland or mixed edge habitats. That's pretty novel for the I think this is 1998. There's not a lot of people really were doing that kind of work at that time. What they suggest, though, is that, take a look, in Clovis times, about 12,000 years ago, 40% of the species suggest closed habitats. As you come more recently in time to the Archaic, 73% suggest closed habitats. Again, this depends on how they're defining closed versus open. Notice that 25% are coming from ecotonal environments. Here, 27% and 20%. And then from open ecosystems, 35% during earlier times, 20% and 7%. So this study is suggesting then that, most of these ecosystems are probably on the closed end of the spectrum, but yet they were recovering species like prairie chickens and bobwhite quail, persimmons, and all these other species. So it really begs the question, did they code these species accurately to what we know their ecological preferences are? Now I'm going to ask you a question real quick. Suppose then that you're an archaeologist and you're studying cultural remains of Native American sites. But what if you're not a botanist? What if you have limited training in botany, right? Are you reaching into a discipline that maybe is too far out of reach to be able to draw some of these conclusions? It's important if you don't really know botany or really know mammalogy or herpetology and the ecological preferences of those plants and animals, that you don't overreach and attempt to oversimplify. It's extremely important that if you don't know it yourself as a scholar, then what should you do? You better partner up with somebody who does. You better get with somebody who's good at what they do. If you don't know plants and you're about to publish a paper and you don't know jack shit about plants, you better collaborate with a professional botanist, right? Or a snake specialist. Specialists are extremely important, but I say that, guys, to emphasize a point very crudely. There's a tendency today in this modern era for a lot of people to want to be generalists and for people to begin to sort of put the specialists aside and say, you know what, specialists are of the 60s. Specialists are so like 1970. I'm going to study my molecular techniques and I'm going to make a bunch of overgeneralized conclusions. And you specialists in like mammals and you specialists in butterflies and you specialists in plants can just go retire because your day in science is coming past. But if we do that, and I'll tell you that it's a very common phenomenon these days in academia. Be aware of it, my friends. Don't fall victim to it because you'll see it in academia. I see it every day. I've seen it for the past 17 years of my career. People will diminish the immensely complex knowledge that it takes to know where species grow and what their preferences are and where they should be on the landscape. And that comes through a lot of trial and training. No, those people aren't testing hypotheses. They have very valuable information to contribute. So in studies like this, and it goes into all disciplines, if you don't know what you're doing, don't overreach. Ask a friend in another discipline to join you, join forces, collaborate Cross-disciplinary is good to really have the best perspectives. I'll tell you what, wish you calm down a little bit, okay? You and me gonna have to have a conversation. Okay, calm it down. Stop the profanity. Okay, we get your point, right? Y'all understand what I'm talking about? I've seen it 17 years, so I get a little bit hot on this issue. Okay. Let's talk about some other innovations of the archaic. Well, at the same time that people were settling down into villages, domesticating crops, they also were innovating technologically. They were creating clay pottery to hold and store those crops. Think about it. The more grains you bring back, the more what you're going to have in your village. Mice and hispid cotton rats and marsh rats and white-footed mouse, right? They're going to be eating up your crop. They're going to be pooping and peeing in it. You need pottery with lids so you can help preserve that stuff and keep it unspoiled. You're going to develop grinding stones for making flour so you can make a variety of different types of meals. So lots of innovations in shelter design, improvements in shelter and storage. Soapstone is a type of rock that we get from the Blue Ridge Mountains through trading. So they would specifically trade with tribes of the Blue Ridge and the Piedmont to get soapstone, which you can actually carve and sort of mold into rocks. It's a very soft rock. Now we enter the woodland period, 3,200 years to 1,000 years ago. Continued innovations in technology, continued advancements toward a sedentary lifestyle. Again, a lot of agriculture, a lot of sort of staying put with more permanent villages. Maybe you'd have summer villages and winter villages, sometimes in different hunting grounds. That was pretty common as well. A big innovation during this period is the bow and arrow. So we get really late into Native American settlement here in North America to find the bow and arrow really comes around a couple thousand years ago or less. And a bow and arrow can't shoot a big, heavy stone projectile tip, right? They have to be really small. We also see continued innovations in pottery making, a lot more finesse, a lot more artistic approaches being put on that. We're seeing new crop plants being introduced through trade networks with Central and South America. Things like gourds and corn and some of these types of plants. Maize, Zea maize is corn. Introduced into the Southeast around 2,000 years ago, by the way. So trade networks were extensive. They were linking up coastal communities with the Great Lakes tribes, Great Plains tribes, and Rocky Mountains tribes were trading things as far east as this region. So, you know, you might have gotten a piece of obsidian, an obsidian projectile point, which was traded from a tribe in the Rockies that made its way here. Or coastal shells might have been traded to a tribe in the Great Lakes region through trade networks. Copper that was being mined and used by tribes in Michigan was traded with tribes farther south into Tennessee. Now we have things like earthen mounds, these effigy mounds, where they would make ceremonial mounds. These became especially prevalent in the woodland period. We see a lot of these like up in Ohio and where we have the serpent mound in the shape of a snake. These had various kind of ceremonial and burial purposes. Continued innovations in stone spear points from the very large ones. I apologize for the grainy nature. I could not get this as a clearer version. All the way up into the very most recent woodland types, which are quite small, specifically adapted to putting on arrow tips. And as we get into the woodland era, we begin to see these different expressions of different cultural groups that are well marked to archaeologists. We're not going to get into these because I don't know them, but I'm mainly just to show you the diversity of the cultural types that are beginning to emerge. That's a big part of this last few minutes I want to emphasize, is lots of languages emerging. Dozens and dozens of languages emerging in the East. Lots of different cultural traditions. You know, what one group is doing on one creek valley down here is becoming differentiated from maybe a watershed to the north. So these are, they're not thinking of themselves as distinct tribes. Cherokee does not really exist at this point. Chickasaw does not exist. Those are later things, later developments that come about much later. By the time we get to the Mississippian, at roughly 1,000 years ago, all the way up until about the year 1600 is the Mississippian period. We have large expansive cities that rival those of Mesoamerica, of Central America. This is Cahokia, which is just across the river from St. Louis, Missouri. Tens of thousands of people that were living in these villages. Here in the region around Nashville were some also large villages of several thousand individuals at least. And as we get into this later period, all the way up again till, especially in about the 1400s, lots of villages across the south of the Mississippian people that all share sort of a distinctive culture. Castalian Springs, for example, is just north of Nashville. Sellers is near Murfreesboro. Mountain Bottom, Sarah, didn't you say you worked there? That's down in Ashland City area. And these were villages of, in some cases, dozens of homes. Oftentimes they had a palisade around them for protection, suggesting that at this point, intertribal warfare was increasing, that they were suffering attacks from neighboring tribes. So they built a palisade of a wooden palisade. This also suggests the importance of trees, right? You have to have wood to build those palisades. But notice that, like this artist rendering shows, other than the floodplain of this creek where this village is located, everything else is depicted as forest. Is that an accurate view? We're going to explore that, especially in the next series of lectures. We still have the remains of some of these cultures today, such as extensive, what we call shell middens. These are where they have oyster shells or mussel shells. Basically, this is a trash heap for Native Americans. We're harvesting these mussels, and all of these were deposited on the shores of the Tennessee River here as a cultural sort of trash heap from past Native American cultures. I'm going to go past that. I'm going to leave you with this as the last slide. Is these Mississippian cultures began to disappear in the Nashville area about 1450. So this is 42 years or so before Christopher Columbus lands on the island in the Bahama Islands. Already we were seeing Native American population collapses from this region. By the time that the first Europeans will come to this region in the 1500s and 1600s, they find that this region especially is largely completely vacant of any Native Americans permanently living in Middle Tennessee or in parts of Kentucky. It becomes known as the vacant quarter hypothesis. The idea that there are no people there, there are no Native Americans there, so we should just be able to move in and claim this land. I'm going to stop there. I'm going to give you guys a few minutes to ask questions about the midterm. We're going to pick it up a week from today. We're going to start with what are the Native American tribes that are in this region over the past 200 or 300 years. We'll talk about the Cherokee, Chickasaw, Shawnee, Choctaw, etc. And then we'll begin to introduce the major European players and influences of Euro-American settlers and explorers into this area. All right, let's stop there. Let's ask some questions.